Okay, so first of all, as always, I wanted to welcome everybody to 929's Beit Midrash and Book Salon. As always, I also wanted to thank 929 for their support. 929 is really a remarkable effort, the number signifying the number of chapters in Tanakh, to get people not only studying Tanakh and working their way through those 929 chapters, but engaging with Tanakh in various ways, both scholarly, traditional, and new ways of thinking about the Tanakh, sometimes inspired by popular culture, like what we'll be doing together. We'll be discussing Cynthia Ozick's Antiquities. I do hope that everybody read it. If you didn't, it is wonderful, and I highly recommend reading it. And it is relatively short and kind of quick and, I won't say easy reading because there's a lot to think about, but it really is yet another remarkable book by a remarkable woman who, if I'm not mistaken, is now 92 or 93 years old. So that will be at the center of our discussion. I also will be studying together with you two sets of texts. One is a kind of meditation on antiquities and things, inspired by a Polish Hasidic thinker. The other thing, which will be sort of more obvious, will be thinking just a little bit about the Jewish community in Elephantine. We won't be spending that much time on the scholarly reconstruction of this community, although it is fascinating. It's actually one of the great discoveries of regarding ancient Judaism that's ever been made. But we will read just a little bit from a text that was composed by those Jews. And we'll also be looking at a rabbinic passage about another Egyptian Jewish community that seems to bear parallels, if not genetic parallels, but at least in our eyes can teach us something about this community. Now, I'm going to be doing it a little bit differently today because I am still stumped by this book. I think it's remarkable. I think there's a treasure there, as the title even makes explicit. But I don't feel I solved it in the way that I sometimes feel I've solved or gotten at the crux of the book. So I really actually want to work together and try to think about what really lies at the heart of this book. I have some ideas and some inklings, but I'd love to hear yours. And to begin with, we'll start as is our wont, just by getting general reactions to the book. These could be, firmly held likes or dislikes of the book, or anything in particular that people want to say before we get the meat of our discussion going.
I think the book is about privilege.
Okay, excellent. Can you say a bit more?
The narrator is so clueless as to how he relates to the world at large, because he's put himself on such a pedestal that everybody else is other than his tight little his cohort of other privileged, wealthy white men. Yeah.
But yet even they are sort of othered. He's almost a clique of one.
Of one, right?
Yeah, so privilege is definitely shot through the whole novel. Okay, we'll probably get back to that. Other comments or reactions to the book? Yes, Nina.
I love the physical setting, the notion of this school turned into a series of luxury apartments, but still sort of Gothic and weird.
Yes, the setting is remarkable. I mean, it's spelled out very quickly, but the first few pages I was reading, I thought I was in England. And then, it becomes obvious right away, even though there's so much care about which accents are to be preferred, the Oxford over the Cambridge and the Anglican education. But obviously we're in Westchester, which ironically or not, in the eyes of many nowadays, is a very Jewish place, right? You have plenty of Jewish communities there. But of course, in the mid 20th century, and to a certain extent even today, there's a strong sort of waspy, and dare I say, anti-Semitic strain that can be found in this part of the country. So the setting is great. Now, let's say maybe just a bit about the name of the school, right? What's the name of the school?
Temple.
It's Temple, right? And that name actually has been a bit of a headache to the school because fellow anti-Semites in Westchester County had thought that it was some sort of synagogue, even looking at the stained glass windows, and even smashed those stained glass windows on one occasion or another. And yet it's not Temple because it is a Jewish place of worship, but rather it's named after a temple, someone whose last name was Temple. So already there, on the one hand, we're given a very, as you said, Nina, very kind of rich description of this, privileged, waspy, old school where people are living after having come back following life. And at the same time, there's a bit of play with the true identity or what really is happening in this space. Is it really entirely waspy, or is there some space for others, even Jewish others, in the school? Other comments or reactions to the book? Are there any avid Ozic readers with us?
Yes.
So Sandra, what did you think? I mean, how does this sort of compare to?
I thought it had so many wonderful Ozic strains. I'm hypnotized by her use of language. I mean, she gets me in the first 10 lines, and I'm compelled to keep going. Even in her books of essays, and I love novels, love them. I mean, they're I can't imagine being alive before the advent of the novel, which means new, and it was a new form of writing. But her essays just get you. And so this is a novel-long essay, and it's a journey. It's a journey. If I had to pick one word, following the other participants using single words, which I know you like us to try to compress our thinking into, which is a great discipline, I'd say journey. And that's the reason I keep reading, other than the fact that I'm compelled to read her words and the way she puts them together. And look, being a Bible scholar, if you don't like words, go home, but she's got me, and she always has got me. And it's a novel or essays. What did Billy Crystal used to say? If they wrote a menu, I'd read it out loud, and that's how much. If she wrote a grocery list, I'd want to read how she put it together.
Yes, that's right. I mean, one of the ways that she's described is as a stylist, right? That word kind of defining.
Yeah, but that bothers me. That has a little bit of a canny. It has a little bit of a cannyism in it, a notion of intentional trickery or something. Yeah, artifice. I wouldn't go with stylist. I'd go with, oh goodness, magician.
That's great. And also, funny enough, there is a list that is, beautifully constructed, a packing list in this at the beginning of the novel.
Absolutely.
And I sort of turned to this is, again, the description of the main character's father's list. I turned to that page a couple of times, and I just sort of marveled at how she pulled that trick, that you attributed to Billy Crystal.
There's another list as well. There's the list at the end.
Yes, that's right.
Of the books in the kitchen.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's, the great writers are aware of the power of such lists and such.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if this, this other name will upset or delight people, but Susan Sontag was known, to create these endless lists in her diaries, also that were very much constructed and not just, conveying content. So yes, I mean, a remarkable writer and taking us on a journey. Other reactions before we dig even a little bit into the content of the novel? Has anyone read? Oh, has anyone read the Pagan Rabbi? That collection of stories. Okay, good. So at least I saw at least one participant has read that book, because one of the things I want to think of beyond the sense of a life journey and beyond the great use of language is the sort of cultic bazaar that he's wrestling with in this book. The Pagan Rabbi is an example. It's impossible to summarize, but I do recommend people to read it as another example of Ozek kind of thinking through the power of religion, the power of the cult, especially when it's heterodox or seemingly pagan, right, in one way or another. So I also want to spend quite a bit of time trying to unravel the idolatry or whatever it is that sits at the center of the book. Okay, so if there aren't any, oh, actually, I'm sorry, Sandra, you wanted to add something?
No, it's okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so I wanted to start just thinking about the title of the book and the objects, of course, that are at the center of the book. So we have this term Antiquities. Obviously, the title refers to the very Antiquities that the father of the narrator had collected. More broadly, being part of an archaeological expedition at a time, at the beginning of the 20th century, where there already had been a kind of fever of collecting such artifacts, either through appropriate or at least justified means, or also pillaging, frankly. And it's never entirely clear whether any of these objects are really provenanced or appropriately gotten. So I want to think about that term, and then I also want to think about the power of stuff. We often think
what power of
stuff, things.
Oh, stuff.
I'll even say the word tchotchkes, right? The beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and we don't know whether these are just tchotchkes. But I want to challenge, the notion that tchotchkes are merely just tchotchkes, right? Regardless of whether they really are valuable. Usually, what happens with a tchotchke is that at some point you bring it in to be appraised, or you might have to get that old watch fixed, and you are told that actually this is a very commonplace piece. It has no real value. And yet that's not true, because for many people, these tchotchkes have great value. So I want to think through, antiquities, artifacts, and more specifically, tchotchkes, to get us thinking about the power of these objects. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. Okay, let's look at just a few of these. Can people see the text here? It's Ozek Antiquities. Great. Good. Okay, so one thing I just put at the top to think about is a sort of artificial distinction between artifact and artifact. For those of you versed in continental philosophy, it kind of reminds us of différence and différence. There's no real difference between these words. One is sort of a British spelling and one an English spelling, though sometimes authors, writers do try to make a distinction between an artifact with an I and an artifact with an E. And one way of thinking about this is an artifact with an I is an object produced or shaped by human craft, especially a tool, weapon, or ornament of archaeological or historical interest. Right? So an artifact would be a great find that archaeologist has discovered in a properly executed, authentic dig. An artifact with an E, one way of thinking about this is an artificial product or effect observed in a natural system, especially one introduced by technology used in scientific investigation or by experimental error. And there have even been artists who have sort of played with the distinction between the artifact with an eye, where of course it's a it's a product, right? It's constructed, but it has scholarly value. It has sort of humanistic value, and an artifact where the artifice of it is sort of placed full center. I don't want to get kind of beyond that, but I do want to think about sort of the different ways by which we classify such objects and such things in our world, both being produced by humans, but being valued differently. What I do want to spend talking about is actually something I used. I don't know if anyone with us was a member of this book club when we used to meet in person, and we were just playing Nicole Krauss's Forest Dark. But this is one of my favorite teachings, and I just want to share it for a way of thinking about these antiquities and these artifacts in the book. So the passage in question, or what inspires this meditation on stuff, on tchotchkes, is a passage in the book of Genesis, in Sefer Bereshit, where Jacob is getting ready to greet his brother Esav after years of estrangement. He's already begun the process of trying to re-win or win his affections. But there's a sense of danger in this whole section of the story. And yet, along the way, at least the way this text is read by the rabbis, there's the most banal fact that's conveyed to us. So I'll just read it quickly. That same night, hold on, let me just move the window here so I can see this. That same night he arose, taking his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 children. He crossed the ford of the Yabok. After taking them across the stream, he sent across all his possessions. Jacob was alone, and a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. Now, I'm interested in this verse, in verse 24. On the one hand, we just get kind of logistics, quite literally. He's taking his family across the stream on this journey. But there's something sort of a little bit strange or notable in the text. And that is, depending on how you read it, he might go back after having taken them across the stream. He seems to go back to the other side where his family is not there, right? And that's why he alone wrestles with this mysterious man until the break of dawn. And he seems to do it, he seems to go back across the ford again for his possessions. Okay, so first he takes the people, then he goes back for his possessions, but he's still alone, and he's alone because of his possessions. So the rabbis and the Midrash is, were attuned to this sort of unusual piece of the logistics here. And Rashi most famously quotes a passage from the Talmud. This is what he says. Shachach pachim katanim v'chazar lehem. He had forgotten some small jars, and he returned for them. Now, Rashi, rather than making something complicated easier to understand, has marvelously taken something that is curious and made it even more curious. Right? Not only has he emphasized and underlined the way that Jacob has gone back to the other side, but he said that really all he forgot were some small jars. And he did not forget the great paintings, great jewels. No, he forgot some small jars. That's what brought him back to the other side. That's why he spent the night alone. And that's why he had to wrestle with this threatening and mysterious man. Right? So there's something really unusual about this comment by Rashi that's worth pondering. Now, Rashi again is quoting from a passage that appears in the Talmud. The way the Talmud generally takes it, as we'll soon see, is about the value that we should have for even our smallest possessions. Right? And this is because good people get even their smallest possessions not through ill-gotten means, but in appropriate measure. And it becomes kind of like a homely, statement about the value of, I don't know if it's thrift, but just taking care of your things. Now, sort of magically, the passage I want to share with you and contemplate together is what Rav Tzadok Cohen of Lublin does with this teaching. Rav Tzadok is, again, 19th century figure, Polish Hasidut. He's also has kind of a foot in the non-Hasidic world, we could say. And he does some remarkable things specifically on this borderline, between sort of standard teachings in the canon that are not necessarily, specifically Hasidic teachings, which he then breathes, incredible spiritual life into them. So this is what he says. So the tzaddik's holiness, the righteous person's holiness, extends also to his property. And it says regarding Jacob that he stayed back in the camp for small vessels. This teaches us that for the righteous, their money is more precious to them than their bodies. Why would this be the case? Because they do not partake of stolen goods. So far, he's quoted the piece of Talmud from which, that idea that Rashi shares is taken. It has to do with, the fact that the righteous only get their things in the proper way, and therefore they have value. But he's already added an unusual idea that their holiness extends, the holiness of the righteous extends also to their property. This means that they do not take that which is not coming to them from God. Meaning if something comes into their possession, it's only because God willed it to. That is what it means, my daily bread, a famous verse in Psalms, that his portion has been established and carved out in stone. So even whatever possession we're talking about, right, if it is owned by a righteous person like the patriarch Jacob, that didn't just coincidentally come into his possession. It wasn't, forgotten or showed up in one way or the other, but it's a divine decree, right, that has put that object into their possession. And it refers to stolen goods based on that which it says, if it is as if he stole from the holy blessed one as he and the congregation of Israel. For to the Lord is the earth and its fullness. Meaning that beyond the teaching which emphasizes how the righteous do not receive stolen goods, remarks on the fact that anything that God has not decreed should come into your possession is stolen. Right? In other words, it's not merely stealing from other people, but sort of before, without divine sanction, any object, anything is God's, right? And only, right, when the proper transaction takes place does it come into your possession. Now, the rabbis take this in other contexts to explain why a bracha, why a blessing is necessary. Before you make a blessing, it's not yours. You might have bought it at the market, but that apple is not yours, it's God's. And the blessing is a way of acknowledging God and bringing that object into your possession. So he's extending that kind of more broadly to property. And that which is not created for them is considered for them stolen goods, and they do not extend their hands to take it. And for that reason, their money that is dedicated to them was created for them. It is beloved upon them, to the extent that Jacob risked his life for them. Similar to what the great and holy rabbi, blessed memory, who heard in the name of the Rebbe of Pezishka, and who heard in the name of the holy Yehudi, now we're getting to Hasidic teachings, that something which is connected to the tzaddik, one is obligated to go and benefit from it, even risking one's life. Right. So this sort of relates to that practice still current to this day of trying to engage with, right, benefit from the things that have been brought into the possession of a tzaddik. So shirayim, the remnants of a tzaddik, are seen as holy because of this principle. And he takes it back to our passage. For this reason, Jacob, our father of blessed memory, who knew that the small vessels were his and were connected to his soul and had been created for him, he gave his soul to bring them over the river. So the teaching is, according to Rav Tzadok, that the reason why Jacob went back, the reason why Yaakov went back to bring these pachim ketanim, these little small jugs, is not just because he was, a spendthrift, or because he worked hard and he wasn't, he wasn't going to even abandon small property. It's because that property was perceived as holy since God had asked for that property to kind of come into his possession. Now, sort of taken more broadly, and of course, what Tzadok is referring to the righteous here. This is a fascinating idea of thinking about stuff, about tchotchkes, right? About anything that that comes into a property, and that sort of gains a magic because of an idea that they were somehow destined, right, to be ours. Right? This isn't just, an old shard. This isn't merely an ornamental stork, maybe from, maybe from antiquity, and maybe not. These things somehow, right, possess a kind of magical value to them. And I think, whether it's through a tzaddik or through other theories of material culture, and even kind of tchotchkes, right, there's a way of thinking of tchotchkes not only as sort of detrimental, but as somehow pulsating with, a divine decree. Yes, Sandra.
Okay, so if I can ask you this, so going a little bit earlier in Genesis, into chapter 19, when the two angels came to rescue Lot from Sodom, and he turns back and he wants to go back. Whether there are Midrashim, those of us who've written and taught about it, but we can never. But there are Midrashim saying he turned back, he wanted to go back and get some of his things, and there are Midrashim that say he wanted to fill his simila, his pockets with the pearls and whatever else stuff he had left that he couldn't bear to leave, and that one of the angels actually grabbed him and yanked him out and pulled him out. So my question to you is, because we're reading Genesis and Yaakov, and we're bringing these, it's a whole, an unfurled ribbon of story that we're supposed to remember the first time, the second time, and the third time people are pulled from their stuff. And how about when Abraham and Sarah leave Egypt, and they leave kaved ma'od, they leave heavy with possessions. And of course, the Torah tells us in chapter 12, it says they had shifchot, and they had lambs, and they had cattle, and it enumerates the stuff, and it shoves them out of a plague-ridden evil place. And it says they were heavy with stuff. So knowing all of this reference to stuff, and how it's almost takes on a poisoned quality, or at least a touch, a tinge.
But only in one case that I'm familiar with and that you mentioned does it seem to be dismissed, and that's specific in the story of Sodom. And I think that sort of tells you something, again, connecting to this idea of Tzadok. Of course, we're like wild in the world of modern thought, really. But modern Hasidic thought, but I think there's something to what you're saying. In the case of Lot, get out of Sodom.
Get out.
But the whole enterprise of Sodom, right, is
stuff as opposed to humans. Stuff. Stuff opposed to humans.
But in the other stories, right, there is great value placed on Abraham's, things, and exiting with, just kind of thinking of, along the lines of from Tzadok. The difference, again, is whether it's the righteous, right? Whether it's the tzaddik who kind of understands this deep truth about how things move into the domain and not.
So then it's the person who possesses the stuff that gives the stuff its either
and acknowledges it's not just the person, but the person who's able to kind of understand that the things that we have, the things that we carry, aren't just happenstance, right? But somehow this could be like a real justification for the pack rat, the people who can never throw out their things. I'm sure it has been, but I think there is something to be said specifically for the tzaddik, for the person who acknowledges that the reason why it came into their property was not because they went out there and conquered or took or made a lot of money, but somehow it came there. Yeah, Marcia. Oh, Marcia.
So you've given me a completely different perspective on something that I saw and had absolutely no comprehension of. And that was a Lubavitch wedding where the Chatan was dressed in a shirt of the Rebbe and then put the kittel on top. Like, you've just put in a completely new perspective on something that I thought was just incomprehensible.
Wow, that's wild. Thank you. So I
And
want to use this.
Shai,
I want
how
to use this
about
to think about this stuff in the novel, right? How are we to think about these things collected, you know, from this problematic trip that the father had taken, this mad episode in his life, the things that no one wanted really. I mean, certainly his mother did not want them. What are we to make of these things as they work their way through the novel, and particularly that prized possession which is given to Ben Sion, you know, Elephantine? Is there some theory of stuff that Ozek's working with? It, are we supposed to think of these in a positive light? Are these idolatrous? Can that help explain the enthusiasm of the main character versus the dismissal by Ben Sion? How did you process the things and the sacred objects or non-sacred objects? I'm curious.
I think they are somewhat idolatrous because they're in lieu of his father. They stand in place for his father, who he doesn't understand or love, or we don't hear a lot about their relationship. We hear about these things.
Interesting. Yeah. So the fact that they are kind of a replacement, you're reading as sort of the definition of idolatry, instead of, you know, worshiping the father, right? Or having a real engagement with the father, you just have the things. Luther.
Since the source that you mentioned seems to make a distinction between that which is stolen and that which is not, we don't actually know for sure whether these objects were acquired legitimately or if they are in fact stolen.
Yes. No, that's sort of an interesting aspect of the story, and also, frankly, is a live issue in the study of the ancient world, and particularly with archaeology. I mean, certainly things that are non-provenance are actually illegal in certain political contexts to trade in. The world of antiquities traders is a world, right? Is a world with its dark corners. But even kind of more recently, there's been thinking about whether also those properly executed digs by Western, powers in the Middle East are actually, justified. Can you just go, and because you have the expertise and the funds to dig these things out of the ground, does that give, the British Museum, for example, the right, to hold on to these things? So I think Ozek is aware of that, that discourse, and it's, I think, one part of the question about where these things came from, right? Are they ill-gotten, and therefore, problematic, even devilish, or are these, from an episode when this character's father was deeply interested? He took them out of the ground himself when he went, one day alone with a guy. It's unclear and it's open. I saw some other hands. Yeah, Nancy.
1 second. I don't think of it as idolatrous. I think of it as building a connection. I mean, my husband and I have a lot of stuff, as you say, but like the things that I have from my grandmother, from my aunts, from my friends that I kind of keep me connected to those people because it was something that was important to them or something that I remember seeing in their house. So that kind of, I thought of it more as, because maybe he didn't have such a strong connection to his father, he could at least be close to his father because of the stuff that he kept of his father.
Good. So this is almost sort of the reverse kind of way of thinking from what Nina mentioned earlier, right? So yes, it is sad, right, that his father did not really provide the possibility for that kind of relationship, but this is something that he can hold on to. Now, I wanted to kind of think a little deeper with this stuff and actually ask where it came from or where it might have come from. The claim is made that especially the stork or the ibis, or half ibis, perhaps came from this ancient community in Egypt, and maybe even this Jewish community that had once dwelled in a garrison town in Egypt. What do we make of that? I mean, is this a moment of just an unreliable narrator telling us things that can't be true? I mean, he was, to be fair, only 10 years old when he comes upon this realization that perhaps this object is somehow connected to his mysterious friend, Ben Zion. Is this from, I mean, is this from the community? And is that why Ben Zion, again, I'm just working this out with you. Is that why he refuses, or is it completely not from the community? It's an insult, maybe because of its seemingly idolatrous nature, and therefore the gift of this ancient object is rejected. What did you make of this when reading the story, in terms of where this object really came from, beyond the father and the relationship with the father? Is this really from Elephantine? Is this, yeah, Laurie?
I kind of struggled with this all the way through because of the historical context. Elephantine is at this crossroads of the Egyptian community, the Persian community, and the Jewish community. And so the fact that this ibis came from a place where these two cultures meet, and Flinders Petrie, of course, is known for developing chronological archaeology. To me, that was a very big piece of this whole story about, does he develop a chronology, a historiography that's valid and later is disproven or problematic? And so this tension of this object that came from this very mixed culture, to me, reflected the tension between the descendant of Petrie and this Elephantine boy, and the tension between the Jewish culture and the external world.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, when you said at the beginning that you were stumped by this book, that was the thread that had me going all the way through.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe this is a good opportunity to just spend a little bit of time learning about this community. I'm going to do a share screen. I don't have much here because we don't have much time. That's not the right document. Hold on. Okay, can people see again the Word document? Okay, so let's talk about, first of all, the last name and more, and specifically the place. Right, so this is a nice little map taken from Wikipedia. You can see, just to kind of get your bearings, this is modern day Egypt. This is modern day Israel. This is the Sinai. And this is a modern map. I mean, this is a map that has modern political boundaries. But actually, if you were to sort of draw it in more ancient terms, Elephantine would be at the very bottom of Egypt, right? And that's important. It's important that it is on a borderland, because as Laurie told us, reminded us, this is a site of a very important garrison town, or garrison, a Jewish chayalim, I mean, the Aramaic term is basically used in the documents, who were hired by the Persians to protect this this territory. Now, the history of the community, of the Jewish community there, goes back apparently even prior to the Jewish military presence there. Laurie, you know a lot more about this than I do, but I believe there are constructions that it might go back to the 7th century BC. So it's a quite ancient community. The most important, really sensational evidence that we have from the community are papyrus documents from the 5th century BC. But though we have other remains besides the papyri as well, that's allowed scholars, and it's important to mention this. We only know of this community because of scholarly reconstruction. There are hints here and there. I'll show one of them to you. That's a possible hint. But in terms of really knowing anything about this community, it is based on the hard work of scholars digging, reading, reconstructing. And that's important for our novel, right? You know, part of the problem that Ben Zion is confronting, is dealing with existentially, really, is the fact that he feels that everyone has gotten the story wrong, right? The scholarly reconstruction of what he claims to be his roots is off, right? And that also, by the way, I think is part of what's happening here in the relationship between the real and the real object and the fake, the artifact and the with an I, and the artifact with an E. He claims that the scholarly reconstruction was problematic. So I want to just give you a piece of, actually, this is not where the text comes from, but I want to give you just a piece so you can get a little bit of a flavor of the kind of finds that we have and why they're so tantalizing. The original language is Aramaic, right? It's a language that was widely spoken across the Near East, and it was also meaningful as we move forward in time to Jews. In fact, some of our great works of literature are composed in Aramaic. This is just a probably the best known letter, known as the Passover Papyrus, which seems to deal with an issue in trying to observe the Passover way back when in the 5th century BC. Okay, to my brothers Yedaniah and his colleagues, the Jewish garrison, your brother Hananiah, may God or the gods seek after the welfare of my brothers at all time. Right, even there, by the way, in that question of how to translate Elahaya as God or the gods, we can already see some of the questions in terms of how to understand this community, right? Is this a monotheistic community? Very difficult to say. But can this community be connected to the monotheistic community we know from points northeast? Possibly, right? Quite a bit hinges on whether you see this sort of as the gods or God. And now this year, year 5 of King Darius, this is Darius II, it has been sent from the king to Arsames. Now do you count? All of this is reconstructed, by the way. It's in square blocks. 14 days in Nisan, and on the 14th at twilight observe the Passover, and from the 15th day until the 21st day of Nisan, also reconstructed, the festival of unleavened bread, observe. 7 days, eat unleavened bread, right? Now be pure and take heed. Do not do work, and it continues. Do not drink perhaps anything of leaven. Do not eat anything of leaven. Nor let it be seen in your houses, also part of the reconstruction, at sunset and until the 21st day of Nisan at sunset, and bring into your chambers any leaven which you have in your houses, also reconstructed, and seal it up during these days. The letter ends off, at least for us, to my brothers, right? Yedaniah and his colleagues, the Jewish garrison, right? Chela Yehudaya, your brother Hananiah, son of, it's missing. So I want you already to appreciate, there are scholars in the audience, but for those of you who don't spend your days kind of poring over ancient texts, I want you to appreciate, first and foremost, how little we know, actually. I mean, on the one hand, it is sensational that we have this text, which is preserved because of the materials and that great climate of the place in which these documents were found. But so much is filled in by, again, that word reconstruction, by an attempt, a heroic attempt of scholars to make sense of the shards, right? So this is just a taste, and an important taste, of the kind of scholarly work that has been done over the last 120 some odd years since the documents, the papyri, have come into, right, scholarly possession. Now, the kinds of reconstructions we find here seem to be largely informed by reading this text in light of things that we know from other, let's call them more mainstream Jewish texts. So you know quite a bit about the celebration of Pesach if you know your Hebrew Bible and other ancient Jewish texts as well. And this allows you to fill in some blanks. And by the way, this isn't just, I don't mean to be overly critical. This is not flippant. These are not people, these are people who are literally counting spaces, right, of how many letters can fit here, working according to the linguistic layer at the time where this text has been constructed. And yet, right, the work is entirely one of reconstruction and one that's done either in great concert with Jewish texts, standard Jewish texts that we know from elsewhere, or not, right? So the question really that confronts us in a reconstruction like this and in the book, expressed in a sort of crass way, is how Jewish really is this community in Elephantine, right? Is this a Jewish community? You know, that's a very problematic formulation, knowing what we know about the development of Judaism. But we can say a few things. First of all, the name of something almost identical to the name of that four-letter, name of God, Jewish name of God, the Tetragrammaton, is there. Just the, 3 letters of that name. It's there as a name of God. It's also there in names and personal names. So one of the characters, in fact, in that letter bears this name. And beyond that, right, we seem to have people who are, in the letter that we looked at, interested in a Jewish observance that is well attested, right, in the Torah, perhaps the key observance, the key holiday, right, in the cycle of holidays. On the other hand, right, based on the location, the great distance, in fact, it's quite a bit of distance all the way down the Nile from what we know of the land of Israel. The other names that appear, apparently intermarried. The other names of gods that appear. The location of a Jewish temple, which is not much described in what you saw, but is well attested, next to pagan temples, the involvement and the friction in the relationship between the pagan temples and this Jewish, let's call it a Jewish temple, causes scholars to ask all kinds of questions, right? Again, how Jewish is this community? What are we to make of this? And just the last point I want to add to this, sort of the problems of reconstruction here, is there are plenty of communities, Jewish communities or communities connected in one way or another to Jewish communities in the ancient world that we know of from other places in the literature, right? It might be a reference in a Second Temple text. It might be a reference in Josephus, especially, to a community of Jews there. It might be a text in a rabbinic literature. In a way, this community sort of really stands off aside. We have little references to them. We have virtually nothing direct in rabbinic literature. And it's sort of hard to imagine whether we would really know about the extent and the significance of this community were it not for these finds. So yeah, I saw there were a few hands. Luther, Sandra.
Yeah, just looking at the text of the letter, at least in the way that it's been reconstructed, it sounds like Hanan or Hananiah isn't really sure if these guys are still Jewish either. Kind of asking them, are you really, observing this stuff or what?
Yeah, so again, I don't want to kind of spend too much time in this particular letter, but your instinct is correct that some of the correspondence that we find in the letter, specifically, right, with what whether the high priest in Jerusalem did receive a message or did not, does, point in the direction that there was questioning already in, antiquity, to what extent this community is, right, is a real community, a real Jewish community. Sandra.
I'd like to speak to your question, sort of a meta question of, was ancient Elephantine Jewish, or how Jewish was it? And if I could just inject a tiny personal note. So my grandfather and my great grandparents on my grandfather's side were from Persia, and my grandfather was from Egypt, and my grandmother was from Aleppo, Syria, and the one sacred ceremony that stayed with everyone when everything else was subsumed by other cultures was Pesach. Now, the stuff that we are left with as a family of Pesach from this confluence of Persia and ancient Egypt is a whole fascinating, fabulous, fascinating cultural thing all of its own. But I never doubted reading this, never doubted. And I'm listening to him going, wow, it really is a question of personal culture, because I never doubted, never even asked the question that you're asking. So I'm a little embarrassed. Was ancient Elephantine Jewish? I think for sure it was. It just doesn't have the look of Jewish that we're looking at. I mean, did Bavel and the ancient academies up there, Pumbedita, have a clue about what was going on in ancient Elephantine? The answer is heck no. So, but did it exist? Sandra's saying as I'm reading this, yeah, absolutely. And so I was going down this road, this Cynthia Ozick journey, questioning lots of things, but not that. Never questioned that. It existed, and Persia and Pesach existed within that rubric. Not anything that we may recognize, but 100%.
Okay, so I just to be clear, I'm not, I wasn't passing judgment in one way or another.
No, I'm not casting aspersions in any way.
What I'm trying to bring out is sort of the controversy, right? Which is a scholarly controversy, and then becomes very real in the case of this.
100%.
Now, there's one other thing I didn't mention. I mean, I mentioned it, but I didn't sufficiently highlight it. The great scandal, right, at the heart of this community is not, whether or not they, intermarried, but it's the fact that there's a temple there.
A temple, exactly.
That's the scandal, right? The scandal, and we'll see there's another sort of similar story that's told about another Egyptian Jewish community, not just story, but historical fact, where a temple is constructed by Jews at a considerable distance, right, from Jerusalem. And this seems to be the scandal, not only that has kind of informed a lot of the thinking about the community there in the scholarly context, but specifically for this young man. In other words, Ben Zion, right? He is responding to something, right? He's a young man, but he speaks like a book, and he's read a lot of books. So he's really read what scholars have to say about this community, and presumably part of what they have to say that has bothered him has to do with the cult, right, Elephantine, and its proximity, right, to an Egyptian cult or an Egyptian religion where the bull is the prominent symbol, really sort of classic idolatrous images. And he has tried to sort of formulate a way in which not only that this community is legitimate, but actually this community sort of never succumbs to idolatry. This community left, didn't participate in something that everyone besides the Levites, right, participated in, which is the sin of the golden calf. This is the purest community imaginable, right? So all of this is taking place in his mind as he's working through the books that are nicely itineraried in the headmaster's library, and it's a way of sort of him finding himself in relationship to others, right? One would imagine other Jews, but also all these other people, around him from which he, feels profoundly estranged. Okay, so I want to look at just another thing or two about this community, and then kind of open up the discussion more broadly. So I mentioned that there are some ancient hints to the community, possibly, and this is arguable, but I want to put it out there because there is a theory that this, in fact, is. Hold on. Let's try that one more time. Okay. Okay, so I want to look just very briefly at a section of the book of Isaiah. This is an oracle that is directed at Egypt, predicting the faltering of Egypt, the downfall, the loss of influence. But it's actually a really fascinating. It's a really fascinating prophecy about sort of it's not just your typical big changes are afoot in Egypt. But I want to just read a few of the verses to give you a sense of what's being said about Egypt and why some people theorize that this perhaps points to the community in question. So in that day, there shall be several towns in the
Excuse
land.
me, Shai, I can't see it on the screen sharing. So if you have the citation, what is the chapter and verse, please?
So it's chapter 19,
Mhm.
verses 18 to 22.
19.
Chapter 19, verses 18 to 22.
Thank
Can
you.
others see it? Can others see it in front of them? Yeah, okay. So in that day, there shall be several towns in the land of Egypt speaking the language of Canaan and swearing loyalty to the Lord of hosts, right? So this is a vision of, this part of Egypt, or these peoples in Egypt coming to recognize, right, the God. One shall be called town of Heres. Okay, destruction perhaps. In that day there shall be an altar to the Lord inside the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord at its border. They shall serve as a symbol and reminder of the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt, so that when the Egyptians cry out to the Lord against oppressors, he will send them a savior and champion to deliver them. For the Lord will make himself known to the Egyptians, and Egyptians shall acknowledge the Lord in that day, and they shall serve him with sacrifice and oblation, and shall make vows to the Lord and fulfill them. The Lord will first afflict and then heal, right, the Egyptians. When they turn back to the Lord, he will respond to their entreaties and heal them. So this is sort of a turning point in imagining the future of Egypt in this prophecy. And this notion of there being an altar to the Lord inside the land of Egypt, has been read by some. I find it to be rather far-fetched, but it has been read by some as a reference to an actual altar to the Lord inside the land of Egypt, perhaps the origins of this community at the southern border of Egypt. Now, hold on, I see that there is a, okay, I'm going to wait until I just finish this point to check there was something in the chat. This verse sort of formulates a meditation about another Jewish community, actually towards the north in Alexandria, that was that also was the site of a Jewish temple, and perhaps because it was closer in time to the rabbis, or simply because they knew about it, this community caused quite a bit of consternation to the rabbis. And you can see sort of in action them trying to figure out what to make of this community. So it shows up in a number of places of rabbinic literature. I just want to share one of them as quickly as I can from Tractate Menachot. So it's in a discussion, in a halachic discussion about the kinds of things that disqualify priests. The most obvious one would be priests who served for something else, right? Something else means idolatry. If you're a priest and you've, a Jewish priest, and you've served idolatry, then you're out. You're not going to be allowed to perform the service in the temple. Seems like a pretty obvious principle. And the question is there something else going on? Right? The rabbis are always reading, behind the text, looking for that extra inference, and they find it here. The Gemara says, from the fact that it says needless to say, right? Ve'ein sarich lomar, that if they serve something else, by inference, the temple of Onias is not a temple of idol worship, but rather a temple devoted to the worship of God. Right? So what they do is they read a Mishnah that says quite explicitly, obviously, a temple, right, a priest that served idolatry is disqualified. And they turn the thing on its head. They say, for the fact that you had to say obviously must mean that there is a case that might seem to be like idolatrous service, but in fact really isn't idolatrous at all. Or would not disqualify. The priest is still considered to be within the fold. And we don't have time to look at it now, but I will make sure it gets to you by email. What unfolds is a story, or actually two versions of a story, about a very important priestly family, perhaps the most important priestly family from Hellenistic times, of Simeon the Righteous, Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik is old, he's about to die. He realizes that he is about to die because he has this dream about meeting, about meeting an old man, right? And in fact, later he dies. And then there is a question of succession. Who is going to be the high priest after him? Will it be his son, Onias? Or will it be his eldest son? Normally one would think it would go to the eldest son, Shimei. And again, in two versions of a story, there is some kind of jealousy, some kind of subterfuge that takes place in a way that gets Onias to leave, run away, in fact, right, from Jerusalem, and found this new altar, this new temple in Alexandria, and start serving sacrifices there. Now, again, in the monotheistic system, especially by the time of the rabbis, a temple outside of Jerusalem, and in Egypt, no less, is anathema. I mean, it is literally a symbol of paganism. And yet, in one of the versions, and in fact, the dominant way that the Talmud is reading this Mishnah, the temple of Onias, even if it might be problematic, one could somehow rehabilitate it by saying it was done for true intentions, right? For intentions for heaven. So the question I want to kind of open up from these sources, and then I'd like to hear more of, is the extent to which idolatry, right, symbolized by the objects in the center of the book, symbolized by the problematic potentially problematic nature of the community that Ben Zion from, to what extent is it actually necessarily as anathema to the world of the rabbis, to the traditional norms after all? Because in a way, Ozek's work elsewhere, but here as well, there's an ability not just to rehabilitate or to argue that these seemingly idolatrous things or these seemingly idolatrous communities are legitimate, but perhaps they're kind of the true religion, right? Some kind of authentic expression after all. That certainly seems to be the argument that Ben Zion is making. The rabbis are willing to entertain, and they quote that verse from Isaiah, that another temple from an Egyptian Jewish community was done for the sake of heaven. And it kind of brings us to think about to what extent there is a scandal at the heart of this book, or to what extent actually things are pure, right, at that center. So I want to kind of open up the discussion. Would love to hear responses both to the sources, more to the book, and other things that you're thinking of. Okay, Rachel or Luther with Rachel's screen. Oh, you weren't.
No, it's hello. So I think I might be the one person here who didn't read the book. I saw Antiquities and I was like, I thought it was going to be more of a history thing. So that tells you how much I did not read this book. Having said that, I do a study group where we've often talked about like how, especially in the settlement of Israel, like how other nations would have seen Hashem, and sort of the wording in the Chumash and the Navi about like, when Hashem says, I'm the only one, is he talking about one among many or one alone? And so I wonder, in this context, if it's not so much that the rabbis are allowing Avodah Zarah as that it's not the Avodah Zarah we think it is. And the idea that like, oh no, these days if it smacks of Avodah Zarah, we can't do it, but maybe the fences were wider or narrower, meaning like maybe there was more that wasn't like, hey, as long as it's not straight up worshiping this idol, it might It might have more flexibility than we think we have. Does that make sense?
So, I mean, what's interesting, that's very interesting, and certainly within different layers of the Tanakh, there, are very, very different conceptions. We're very, very far from, let's say, a pure Maimonidean monotheism. The thing is, though, in the case of what's kind of shocking about how the rabbis respond to the Temple of Onias is that, yes, even the rabbis have, non-Maimonidean ways of thinking about gods and other forces. But the rabbis, at the end of the day, certainly were anti-idolatry. They dedicate an entire tractate to the subject. And one of the ways that they define idolatry, has to do with sacrificing in ways or to beings or in places, right, outside of where one is permitted to sacrifice, right? Going back already to the Tanakh, right, where sort of a line is taken at a certain point that the bamot, right, these sort of open altars, certainly the way the rabbis are understanding it is by virtue of them just being those altars that are not in the Jerusalem center are idolatrous. So I definitely agree with you that there's, depending on the text that you're reading and the stage at which it was composed, there are all sorts of concepts. But what's so interesting, I think, about the Temple of Onias for the rabbis, and maybe Ozick is sort of, taking things in this direction, is the willingness even of those figures, right, to imagine a non-idolatrous temple outside of Jerusalem, and maybe in a non-idolatrous way of being that's sort of beyond the norms. I have many other questions about the book. So I'd love to hear questions, comments about that, but I also would love to hear about the anti-Semitism, which is in the book. Right? It's not incidental. It's clearly not incidental. It's not just the waspy setting. There's Ozick's very interested in anti-Semitism in general, but especially in this book. Do people see that in some way connected to kind of the main narrative with this ostracized boy, with the objects? Is it kind of a sideshow? What do people?
There's another set of objects also, which I think plays into this, which is the typewriter, the Mont Blancs and the Parker pens, the cigar box, that are very important. And
we're reading.
Sorry?
And the manuscript itself that we're reading.
Right.
The result.
Right. And they relate to more that school, I think these anti-Semitism issues and what is sort of the waspy culture, and can you sort of transmute objects by by what the purpose you put them to? And that goes back to the other thing, like if you have a temple, but it's for the sake of God, then you can cleanse it, sort of, so to speak. And can you cleanse these other objects from their original purposes? And
Interesting. Others, what else did people make of either the anti-Semitism or the mystery at the heart of this novel? There's another mystery which is I think by design non-material, right? Or we don't get to see it, and that's what Ben Zion's parents were after. What are they after? Are they after the ark, right? Are they what is this true object that they're after? Again, I sort of haven't solved it, but it's like beckoning. Is it some sort of utterly non-idolatrous truth at the heart of this community that even normative Judaism, even the rabbis can't even truly conceive of? What is it that they're after? What are they looking for?
well, is it an object or is it a manuscript also? Like maybe it's the manuscript that sets forth their sort of articles of faith that would prove beyond a doubt I don't know.
Yeah, it could be there after the papyrus. Yeah, Nancy.
I think of, legitimacy in some way, or who they are. What's still confusing to me, or I'm wondering what Cynthia Ozick meant by this, is the dad's search, which brings back artifacts from that community, is it just sort of coincidental that obviously it's not in the book, but it makes a coincidental sort of connection between what he collected and what belongs to the heritage of this other boy. And when his father was collecting these things, we had no sense of them being representative or legitimizing a community. And then with the other boy being brought in, all of a sudden these things perhaps have a connection to his heritage. And I'm wondering why the book was set like that.
I mean, I think it's a nice way of setting it. It's sort of these things converge magically, but I still struggle to sort of untangle, what's happening there. I mean, one thought, and stray thought in that direction that I had was, who's the guy that the father went off with one day? Is it possible that it's Ben Zion's, father, and that object, connects the two? But it still solves sort of the legitimacy, right? I mean, maybe I just should have immersed myself in the symbols of, this part of the world. But this half ibis stork, like, could that legitimize the community in some way?
Were the objects important to him as representative of the community or representative of his cousin or the man that he was there with?
Who do you mean? In other words, important to
Were they important to the main character, whatever his name is, Petri? Were they important to him because he really was enamored of that culture, or because that was his reminiscence of his relationship with his cousin?
I mean, I think it's also important because he understood that this, bosom buddy, this unique soul, Ben Zion, that it would be meaningful to him.
I have wondered whether the book was going to come out that this boy was in fact from that, that the cousin, as you had said, was looking into his own heritage, and that all of a sudden he was going to have these Jewish roots himself. That obviously didn't happen, but I wondered about that,
Yeah, Sandra.
Okay, so I looked up the ibis stork, and when you say it could be you imply it could be a hybrid, and actually there was such a thing as an ibis stork. That an ibis is a kind of stork, and what it represented in that in ancient times was, wait for it, wisdom and magic, and I think that that's emblematic, literally and figuratively, of what Ozick has done here. I mean, it's on the cover, it's on the escutcheon, it weaves its way through the whole thing. It's a typical Elephantine symbol. It's not something that we even think of. We think of stork. How many of us, other than a child's alphabet book, have ever come upon the word ibis? So I think that we're dealing with a combination of what it meant in those times, the magic and the wisdom. So then we have to dig deeper, as we're doing, and dig Antiquities, and we're digging like archaeologists. What is the true wisdom? Does true wisdom have only the meaning that the Babylonian Talmud and the rabbis there assigned to it? Or does Alexandria and a Jewish community there, where my relatives came from, for instance, have legitimacy? So I think it's fabulous that it's the ibis stork that becomes the symbol. I don't think of it as idolatry. I think of it as, although, it does tread the line, how close, how balanced are you between idolatry and symbolism?
Ben Zion seems to reject it. I mean, on the one hand, this is supposed to show like this is these are your roots, and you're right. I mean, this is sort of a magical symbol. It points in a way, but he seems bothered by the physicality of it. Yes, we're pointing to something, but the real thing is, immaterial. Luther.
Well, The biggest questions I had about the book actually had to do with his relationships because the narrator, emotionally, his life is almost devoid of any close relationships. There are only two, and one is Ben Sion.
Yeah.
We
And
think maybe he might have been Jewish, but we're not really sure. The other is his secretary, Miss Stimmer. And I found myself just now thinking, and I looked. Stimmer is a surname with German roots. It means tuner, as in to tune a piano. But there is also a Jewish family surname, Ashkenazi surname, Stimmer, and many of the Stimmers migrated to Argentina and became separated from their Ashkenazi roots. I just found this on.
thank you. So there are, yeah, so to be fair, there are a number of characters and also names in the book that are, that are Jewish. There's also
Cook.
the cook. Of course, the poetry as well that we get to hear is also Jewish. I mean, in a way, this seems a bit too simple, but the book is a kind of indictment of, you'll excuse me, sort of like white bread, um, waspy, banal America. And Ozek is, and the narrator is sort of, drawn specifically to this kind of Jewish authenticity, right? Now, if this were to be written by a non-Jew, I'd call it what it is. I mean, it's some sort of like, fetishization, Orientalism. I don't even know what. It's interesting that it's kind of Ozek who's sort of playing this in front of us from the perspective of a Gentile writer. And it's not just that he, Ben Zion and these other characters are like more passionate or real, but he takes us all the way back to she takes us all the way back to some kind of, pre-Jewish or early Jewish, Jewish, beyond just the typical Jew in the street. Any kind of parting thoughts?
Just to revert back to the theme of anti-Semitism, Petri never really grows. He has no awareness. Even I take umbrage with calling it a journey, because a journey implies that you're going somewhere, and he goes nowhere. I mean, he may physically have to move out of that school, but he is stagnating throughout the entire
Yeah, and even his accolade and what he gets for for not being a rabid anti-Semite, he sort of admits that he is an anti-Semite. He just kept his mouth shut. So I agree. I mean, he is not. This is
And
not.
that was sufficient for that other guy to consider him a friend. Just is not saying anything.
Didn't beat him up. Yeah. Other final comments? Yeah. You're muted. You're still muted. There
I
you
think
go.
also there's the idea of what is significant. That's really what the book ends with, that somehow the protagonist, thinks he knows what this significant thing is. I'm not really sure what it is, but
I don't think he knows.
he's sure that Ben Sion knows it also. And I think that the kind of the tragedy is that the protagonist really wasn't so significant. He's going to take his transcript, his manuscript, and it's going to go into a box someplace, and no one's ever going to read it. I mean, and the objects that his father had, they might end up on the sidewalk.
I think they likely will. Yeah, I mean, that's one of sort of the most troubling aspects of, especially written by an elderly person. There are real questions. I mean, it's so important writing these different pages. Everyone pages, and who's going to read this? It's going to be a J.P. Morgan and rotting.
Right.
Marshall somewhere.
So Ben-Zion's rejection of the ibis, the possible idol, I think maybe had to do with the rejection of a symbol being the claim to the authenticity of his history, of his worship, of his practice. So there's the rejection of that, because that's an easy reduction. Oh, it was a form of idol worship. It's whatever. And then what Leah said made me think combining authenticity and significance. And then your much earlier question about tchotchkes, of do they own us or do we own them? And what is their authenticity? Do we give that to them by holding on to them? Do we give them significance because we possess them, because they had something else? So it's just a wonderful combination of all of the above. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sandra, maybe you'll have the last word.
Oh dear, okay. I think Ben-Zion was right, that thinking, or at least within his construct, he was absolutely right to see the ibis as an object of idolatry, because that's how if we're putting our heads not in 21st century America, but putting it into the Elephantine, wherever that was, or Egypt, ancient Egypt, Alexandria, the objects were gods, or were perceived as gods. So I see him too, but what I see is also that these objects, getting back to your question, and remember Tim O'Brien's book, The Things They Carried, which is haunting me too. Do the things represent the people? Do they live through the things? If the person has died, does the thing carry that person on? And I think the answer here, and I think it was Marcia who beautifully said, or someone, I'm so sorry, I don't remember who, but it was so great, said that all those objects are going to end up in a box on a sidewalk. And in fact, so much, you could say, so much for your idolatry. Look what happens. The objects decay. And a lot of what, at least the way I've read Ozick, a lot of what she writes about is in a subtext, a thread, a ribbon thread, is what lives, what dies. Do we all die? What decays? What lasts forever? So I'd have to go with that comment by one of our participants saying it ends up on a sidewalk, and then you have to go, Shai's question of what's the value of the object.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was really great. Thank you for bearing with me, everybody, this time.
Great.
Because I feel like because of you, I'm a little bit closer to kind of appreciating what happened in this novel. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day, wherever you are.
Thank you.
And keep reading and keep learning.